I looked out the side window. There was 3 men running towards the driver. One man I saw, he'd a ballyclabber down over his chin, his head down to his chin, and his face black. And there was a man standing on the bank with a rifle pointing at the van.
At the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, we saw them spill over into the Republic of Ireland in the 70s and 80s. The Gardaí were under increased pressure. Politicians, guards and judges were all targets. They were allegations of forced confessions, intimidation and innocent people being charged with crimes they did not commit. This is the last of a series of 3 to show just this: the Heavy Gang and the Sallins train robbery. In the Republic of Ireland, a newly formed INLA, which is the Irish National Liberation Army, which in turn was an Irish Republican Socialist paramilitary group, was formed in 1974. New legislation was passed. It curtails civil liberties and extends Garda powers of arrest and detention. The IRA were growing in strength. They were carrying out robberies, shootings and other activities, and they were armed to the teeth. At the funeral of Garda Michael Clerkin, who had been killed in Portarlington in County Laois, after the IRA lured 4 Gardaí to a farmhouse and booby-trapped it, killing Garda Clerkin instantly. He was only 25 years of age. This was done in retaliation for the government introducing the Emergency Powers Act, which was passed that same night. This new act would help combat escalating paramilitary activity in the Republic of Ireland. Commissioner Ned Garvey said to Detective Jerry O'Carroll, "Gentlemen, we've got to get to grips with the terrorism and have every means yet at your disposal. Do whatever you have to do, but stop it and bring the people to justice." 6 months after Garda Clerkin was killed, a group of armed men placed explosives on a train track near Sallins in County Kildare. They exploded and stopped the train, and 3 men ran towards the driver. They were wearing balaclavas and their faces were blackened, and there was a man standing on the bank with a rifle, pointing at the back of the train. This happened early morning the 31st of March 1976. They had taken over a house nearby earlier that morning and held a family at gunpoint until they were ready to make their move on robbing the train. This will be one of the biggest train robberies in the history of the state, robbing £200,000. This was very embarrassing for the government because they had made such a stand on security and put in place measures on the people of the state, which wouldn't be tolerated today. It was a very swift and easy robbery, and the robbers even seemed to know which carriage and what bags to take from the mail train. Oscar Brannocht in 1976 was an activist and member of the newly formed Irish Republican Socialist Party. Their goal was to reunite the 32 counties. Since he was 18, he always experienced semi-harassment from the authorities. He never went to a meeting without an unmarked car sitting outside, monitoring and taking notes of the attendees. Oscar was also a journalist at the time. If there was a hint of you anyway acting or working against the norm or outside the realm, you were made note of and an eye was kept on you. A man named Nicky Kelly was also a member of the IRSP, working in Dublin and had an interest in politics. In the mid-70s, the living conditions were very dank and dark, and there was a lot of unemployment. 5 days after the robbery, detectives are told to prepare for a mass arrests. Despite rumours of the IRA being involved in the robbery, they have one focus, which is the IRSP. Oscar was the first to be arrested at the offices. He was greeted there by the Gardaí when he arrived there for work. They were going through his office looking in filing cabinets and looking at membership files. Shortly afterwards, they arrested Oscar and was bundled off and brought to the Bridewell Garda station in Smithfield in Dublin. In a series of raids, 40 members of the party are brought in and their families for interrogation. Nicky Kelly was one of the members that was picked up by Gardaí and brought to the Bridewell also. He received a few digs and punches in the back of the car. This was only a taste of what was to come. From the time Nicky arrived, written statements were being passed to him to sign. These statements were pre-written, but Nicky wouldn't sign them. They beat Nicky with a rubber hose as it prevented him being bruised too much, but it hurt as much. 2 detectives then came in screaming and shouting. One detective picked up a chair and hit poor Nicky over the back with it. They told him they sorted out people in Cavan and had them barking like dogs by the time they were finished with them, and he'd end up the same. The beatings were switched on and off, but the intensity of them only got worse as the time went on. They screamed and shouted at Nicky about being a communist, an atheist, anti-God, and even at one stage threw what they claimed to be holy water over him. They told him that his mother was in hospital after having a heart attack, with the stress of him being arrested. Had he no shame? Did he not care about his mother? When Oscar was brought into the station, he saw it as a tick-tock situation. He'd be held for 48 hours, questioned, and then he'd be released. He was 25 years old, and this had been his experience up to then with the Gardaí. But this time, unknown to Oscar, it would be very different, because investigators specialising in getting confessions would be brought in, known as the Heavy Gang. As Oscar lay in the cell on his first night, he woke up to hearing screams which terrified him. Oscar listened intently, trying to figure out what was going on. After a time, his cell door opened, Gardaí came in and they took Oscar out of his cell, led him down a dark, narrow corridor into a room where there was a number of detectives waiting. So he had detectives behind him and in front of him, and his heart sank. He knew he was in for the beating of his life. They began to slap him, punch him and knee him, throw him against the wall. Basically, they all just laid into him. When it finally stopped, they brought him upstairs to a type of locker room and they laid into him again. Oscar tried to back into a corner to somewhat protect himself, but he couldn't as they were attacking him from all angles. Oscar said it was like playing blind man's buff. You were totally disorientated. You just didn't know where the next punch was coming from, but they came fast and furious. The interrogation techniques are beginning to work. The two boys were completely isolated from each other and from any help. On their downtime, they started to think the worst. For whatever they are going through, will a family member be next to suffer the same fate? But they said they also had selfish thoughts too. Will this ever stop? After 3 days in interrogation, both Oscar and Nicky break and sign the pre-written statements. They concluded that if they signed the statements for something they didn't do, there was no way it could stand up in court. Oscar was at this stage not thinking irrationally and said he would have continued taking the beatings rather than sign the statement. But another part of him said they won't get away with this.
There was a nylon stocking on my face. I went inside the train. 2 men were with me. I threw bags in the field beside the railroad. There were 4 men inside the field, I think. Didn't have a gun, but the people who were with me had guns.
We had arranged to go to Selbridge, where we were to hold up a train. When the train arrived, the detonators exploded and the train halted. Oscar Brannock and someone else, I cannot remember who, unloaded a number of mailbags onto the track. This robbery was planned a couple of weeks ago. I was told this train was carrying a lot of cash. The operation was to get funds for the IRSP.
Almost a year after the train robbery, Oscar and Nicky have been out on bail and they appear in front of the Special Criminal Court in Dublin. This court is a 3-judge, no-jury court. Oscar and Nicky are not the only ones that confess after being interrogated by John Courtney and the specialist investigators. 2 of their colleagues from the IRSP are also put on trial. Brian McNally, who also says he was beaten and coerced into signing a statement. One guard has said to Brian, either you sign the statement or this is going to go on, because I can't get them off you if you don't. Brian signed the statement, but only after his legal period of detention elapsed. This will later raise a question over the legality of his statement in court. The 4th man to be put on trial is Mick Plunkett. In January 1978, the Sallins trial begins again after it being thrown out because there was no book of evidence produced. The trial was in front of 3 judges and no jury, as I stated before. This trial captivated the nation. Pat McCartan's solicitor, who represented the Sallins 4, was quietly confident. The book of evidence, which is the state's case against the 4, didn't have a scrap of evidence against them, except for their 4 statements that they signed. The solicitor went to see the 4 straight after their interrogation, where they were now being held in Mountjoy, and he saw firsthand the state they were in. He saw them individually and each account was the same from them, and he saw the bruises and marks for himself. What the solicitor needed to do now is to get their injuries looked at by doctors, and they concluded that their injuries were consistent with beatings, and this was presented to the court. 2 weeks into the trial, people noticed something was amiss with the proceedings. A man named Martin Reynolds that attended the trial and sat in the public gallery also noticed something is not right. One of the 3 judges sitting in the middle kept dropping off and dozing, as in he kept falling asleep. Martin said he actually wasn't following the case, he wasn't concentrating on the case, he seemed to be going asleep. For the legal team, this was uncharted territory. Both prosecution and defence worked together to try and keep him awake. So barristers would stand up and ask for permission for a break, or they would drop heavy books. These were 4 men sitting there being charged with a very serious offence of having robbed a train, and were facing a very long sentence, and they had one of the judges falling asleep. Only in Ireland could this happen. On day 50 of the trial, the 3 judges retired to consider the defence team's objections about Judge O'Connor falling asleep. They ruled the trial can go on as the judge in question is capable. So they decided that the sleeping judge, who continued to sleep, wasn't asleep. The defence continues to appeal and even got Martin Reynolds, the man in the public gallery, who saw the judge falling asleep, to swear an affidavit stating as such. This prompts a visit to Martin Reynolds' home by the Gardaí. His elderly mother is interviewed and then they call again and interview Martin. They say to him, "You are a well-educated, middle-class professional person, and therefore when you stand up and make a statement, from your background you would be inclined to be believed. Therefore we regard you as a subversive." Martin was at the time a chairman of Fine Gael Central Branch, which is one of the main political parties in Ireland, which would be considered right-wing, and he had no connection to any left-wing or subversive organisations. The 2 kept nagging at him about what he had said in the statement about the judge falling asleep in court. He stuck to his guns and said, "I haven't done anything wrong, I saw what I saw and I'm not lying." In the heel of the hunt, the defence went to the Supreme Court with their appeal against the ruling, and they lost, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice, at the end of his ruling against the defence, described them as a disgrace to the profession. The ruling from the highest court in the land means all 3 judges will continue to hear the case. They are not even pretending this is a fair trial at this stage. The trial went on for 66 days, with the judge asleep for most of it. Then a few days later, the sleeping judge dies. It was obvious the judge had been ill and should never have been on the bench, and so they got a new trial and started all over again. The new trial begins a few months later in October 1978. Mick Plunkett is acquitted after his defence team successfully raised questions about the Garda evidence against him. During the trial, the detectives who have allegations against them are cross-examined. All deny that the accused statements in the book of evidence were coordinated or the confessions forced, but some of these statements raise questions for the defence. The defence couldn't understand how the judges were prepared to accept that 2 interrogators going in to deal with a suspect over hours would come out with virtually the same sequence of events, using the same type of language, the same words and the same construction of sentences. It could only be suggested that they sat down together and wrote the statements, and the men on trial did say that all statements were pre-written. A number of detectives signed statements claiming to have witnessed Oscar and Brian admit to the robbery. These Garda statements are produced in court as key evidence against the 2 men. This was to make it appear that they voluntarily confessed to the robbery. The DPP refuses to allow Brian's statement of confession to be used as evidence in court. He deems it was taken after the permitted time had elapsed. This means that the case against Brian now depends solely on alleged verbal admissions he had made to the detectives. John Courtney, now promoted to superintendent, takes the stand. He insists he got a verbal admission from Brian within the legal required 48 hours, and the judge believed him. This is the only evidence against Brian. All 4 gave evidence of torture and coercion, and the Gardaí denied this in court, and the Gardaí were believed. As far as the court was concerned, the statements were free and voluntary and sufficient to convict. The judge delivering the decision of the Special Criminal Court threw in at the end of his ruling the view that the accused had beaten themselves up. This means the rules of evidence, the rules of investigation, the rules of justice had been torn up and thrown aside. This would never have been allowed if it was a jury trial. Shortly before the verdict, Nicky goes on the run to Boston in America. In his absence, he is sentenced alongside Oscar and Brian. They were sentenced to 12 years penal servitude and were put in Portlaoise prison. Of course, Oscar and Brian appealed their conviction. Meanwhile, there is an outcry nationally and internationally. Rumours of a Garda heavy gang still continues to circulate in political and media circles, but the two still remained in prison. In April 1980, the IRA publicly claimed responsibility for the Sallins train robbery. A month later, the Court of Criminal Appeal quashes Oscar and Brian's convictions, but no one is held to account for the forced confessions and the injuries they received while in custody. Watching from afar, Nicky decided to come home to Ireland. He was warned not to, but Nicky wanted to clear his name. He was met at Shannon Airport by Special Branch and brought straight to the criminal court and sent to Portlaoise prison. When he arrived back in June 1980, the case was over in a sense. He is out of time to lodge an appeal against his conviction. He was also sentenced to 12 years penal servitude, and that conviction still stood. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they say their hands are tied because the appeal time is up. At this stage, Nicky had no option but to go on hunger strike. He was 38 days on hunger strike, and the people of Ireland demanded for him to be released. There were campaigns all over, appeals to the President to intervene. Nicky's solicitor appeals to him to stop, that he has done what he set out to do, and so he did. But Nicky remained in prison. He was offered early release if he dropped the civil action he had towards the state, but he wouldn't, and so he remained there in prison. Meanwhile, another man that had signed a forced confession and who had been in hiding nearly 7 years at this stage was beginning to ask questions as to why he was never convicted. So he decided to come out of hiding and make a public statement. In disguise, of course. This man's name was Sean Fitzpatrick. He called for Nicky's release. Sean tells the press that in 1976 he too was arrested and forced to sign a statement that he was involved in the train robbery. After many beatings, he signed the confession, but only on one condition: he was not going to implicate anyone else. But you see, there was a problem. He was seen by Special Branch that night in Limerick, 203 kilometres away. He also had witnesses to say he had stayed at their house that night. What was the bigger problem for the Gardaí was they had included Sean in the statements as being there, the statements that Oscar, Nicky, Brian and Michael had signed by force and that had been pre-written. So Sean coming out and making this statement put the DPP, Gardaí and the state under fierce pressure to release Nicky. After 4 years, Nicky was released on humanitarian grounds. But Nicky was still not vindicated. His conviction still stood. He was still a criminal. Nicky started campaigning for exoneration, and this was to take 8 years. In Ireland, the presidential pardon is unlike a lot of European countries, or particularly America. It's a statement of total innocence. He receives this pardon in 1992, but this prompts fresh questions. It reveals for the first time that the DPP had reviewed the case earlier and had concerns about the evidence. At the time, it was said that the decision to prosecute by the DPP was exceptionally difficult. He allowed the case to go ahead to court because he couldn't resolve it, and he had the Gardaí saying to him, "This is all clear, they're guilty, we have the evidence, here's the evidence," and he felt, "I just had to let this go to court." In 1983, Oscar lodges a civil action for damages against the state and 8 Gardaí, including Detective Jerry O'Carroll, that would be also involved in the Kerry babies case. After the court case, the state agreed to pay Nicky, Oscar and Brian a substantial compensation. They never got an apology, there was never an inquiry into how the whole thing came about, and no one was ever held accountable for what happened to them in custody. Sean also took a civil case against the Gardaí. Like what happened to Joanne Hayes in the Kerry babies tribunal, they turned this case into the trial of Sean Fitzpatrick, and the judge let this happen. Despite losing his case against the Gardaí, he too received compensation from the state at the same time as the others. No one else has ever been charged with the Sallins train robbery, and the £200,000 stolen was never recovered. But the Sallins case had brought the heavy-handed methods of some detectives to national and international attention. Despite this, allegations of beatings, fabricated statements and coerced confessions continued against many of the detectives for another decade. This impact on the innocent is enormous. An inquiry has never been held into this case. I will leave the last word to Jerry O'Carroll, one of the chief interrogators and members of the Heavy Gang.
I did not see in the bridal that night anybody being ill-treated by any Garda or any other officer. I have no apologies to Oscar Brannock, Nicky Kelly.
In the